Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sun Devil Learning Labs once again. This is Mr. Miranda, and today we're going to talk about evaluating arguments. So before we get on with the lesson, like always, just take out your writer's notebook and a pencil to write with, please, so that you can take down notes. Right. And I'll also pause the video whenever you feel necessary, or pause when I ask you to. Okay, so now let's get on with the lesson. So by the end of today's lesson, you guys should be able to say to yourselves, I can determine whether an author's argument is effective or not. And before we continue any further, I want you guys to think to yourselves, maybe discuss this with someone next to you if you have someone next to you. So what makes you listen? So when someone's telling you about an idea or their opinions, whether that be out loud in a conversation or written in a letter or an essay or an article or something, what makes you pay attention to what the author or your friend or family members telling you? Well, for me, sometimes as long as a person is speaking clearly and communicate what they're trying to say in a way that I understand, and whatever they believe and they say it clearly, I tend to listen to that person. Also, if they support their beliefs or thoughts with some details and reasons why. Also, if, let's say, they give us some facts about something and that supports their opinion, I want to know if the facts are trustworthy or not, because sometimes when I'm in a conversation with somebody and they're trying to convince me to, I don't know, participate in, I don't know, like protesting something that, like a product at a store, because for whatever reason the product isn't good, and they tell me all these reasons and facts, but they can't tell me where they got that information from. I want to believe my friend, but if they don't tell me where the source came from or where that information came from, I don't know if I can trust that information. I'd have to like do my own research if by myself, but hopefully my friend is saying something with actual facts that they can back up and tell me where they got those information from, because I want to believe them. They're my friend. Also, if someone's trying to tell you or convince you of something, sometimes it's not based on facts, but and maybe some of it does have facts, but they add in an emotional story. So they tell you a story of somebody that was affected by something. And let's go back to the example I gave, like with the food. Like, let's say we were protesting like a food product. We say how we can talk about how one person was affected by the company because they didn't provide enough benefits for the workers that work for the company, or maybe the person's telling you, hey, protest this product because it's no good, it gave me food poisoning. So if they tell you a personal story or an emotional story of someone else or their own, that might make me listen, especially when there's emotion involved. You can really hear and visualize what they're trying to say and the emotion through it. And so when someone's emotional or very passionate about something and has facts that supports their ideas or beliefs, that's what makes me listen. So yeah. Okay, so we're gonna go through a few of the concepts that we covered in the last video from Monday. So we need to know what an argument is. An argument is just a reason or a set of reasons that are used to try to convince others that something is right or wrong. A lot of times it can come off as a persuasive thing, like someone's trying to persuade you. But sometimes people aren't trying to persuade you, they're just trying to argue why they think they're right. So there's a slight difference in arguments and persuasive text, but they're really, really similar. And an argument, it includes a claim, counterargument, and evidence. So a claim is just a statement that says something's true. Counterargument is the opposite of that statement, but a good argument would include the counterargument to explain why they don't go with that thought. And evidence. Evidence is just a collection of facts or information, whether it be like statistics or a story of somebody, or somebody's story. I mean, so that all falls under evidence. So any good argument would have these three included. The types of evidence, again, we covered this in the last video. So go back to that video if you want more coverage on it. But if you need to pause the video to take these notes down still, yeah, go ahead and pause the video. But statistical evidence is, again, just represented with numbers, percentages, and surveys. Testimonials are just statements from people supporting a claim, and usually it's it can be by any person, but it's a person that tells you their own experience. And most testimonials that we listen to tend to be from experts or celebrities. Anecdotal evidence is again storytelling, but not like a full-on story. And the story is derived from facts. So maybe sometimes you hear like an essay start out like, okay, this kid hurt himself by accident using this tool. This is why you shouldn't use this tool. Here's a better tool. So sometimes they tell you a short snippet of a story of someone else to try to like get their point across. And this can come off of very opinionated. Again, it's also not the very strongest form of evidence, but it can be made stronger if you add in statistics or someone's own story, like a testimonial. And analogical evidence is just comparing the main claim that the author is trying to communicate with something else very similar, because the thing that the author is trying to talk about may not have a lot of facts or stories to go along with it. So you compare it to the next best thing. This is probably like the least strongest form of evidence, but it's still evidence. It's not always weak, but it tends to be the weakest form. Okay, so when we're trying to determine if an argument is good or bad, we also have to look at the evidence. We have to know if the evidence is good or bad. We have to evaluate the evidence. So again, we covered what relevant evidence was. Evidence that's relevant is good evidence. Relevant evidence connects the claim and supports the claim with reasons. And those reasons are backed by facts, stories, like true stories or anecdotes or analogies. And another thing that makes evidence good is if we have a sufficient amount of that evidence in the argument. So if we're reading an argumentative text, if you might have a good piece of evidence, a relevant piece of evidence, but you need to have at least one piece of evidence that ties back to one of the reasons of the claim. Another word for sufficient is just enough. So you have to have enough evidence. So for every reason to the claim, you have to have one piece of evidence at least. This can be very subjective. It doesn't always have to be a 1-to-1 ratio, but you generally want to have at least one, depending on how long your essay is or what your point is. The amount of evidence that you might need to have may be different. Okay, so what's bad evidence? Bad evidence is irrelevant and insufficient. So we covered what irrelevant evidence was in the last video. Again, it's just evidence that doesn't connect to the claim. and it doesn't even support the reason. So it's just a random statement that was just put out there in the text that doesn't really give us much about anything of what the author's trying to say. And then insufficient evidence. Insufficient, another word for insufficient or phrase for insufficient is just not enough. It's just the opposite of sufficient. Insufficient, opposite of sufficient. And insufficient evidence is when there is less pieces of supporting evidence than the amount of reasons for the claim. So again, a good argumentative text will have relevant and sufficient evidence. And sometimes argumentative text might have relevant evidence, but they might not have enough. So part of that text might be good or bad. But again, ideally, it has both relevant and sufficient evidence. So pause the video if you need to, continue when you're ready. Okay, so one way you can check the author's evidence, like if it's credible or not, to see if it's actually a good thing to listen to, or if it's something we should probably ignore because it's not really the best evidence that supports their claim. We can put it through a test that I used when I was in middle school. My teacher, she called it the CRAP test, with 2 A's. And it's just an acronym for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. And when we look at a piece of evidence and we know where the source is from, we have to look at that source and we have to see when that resource was published. So you can also run the article that you're reading through the CRAP test, but if you're trying to look at the evidence that they use, then you can look at every single piece of evidence that they stated, and run it through the CRAP test multiple times. So when you're looking at a source, whether it be the text you're reading or the sources that the text uses, you check the currency, and that's when the information was published or updated. The relevance, it's important to use a source that relates to the topic that you're talking about, or to the topic that the claim is talking about. So if it doesn't, it's not relevant. It should be relevant. Otherwise, why would you be using that source? And authority, it just means who is just asking who wrote it, or who was the publisher, and can you verify their credentials? Like if you look at a source and it's an article but it doesn't show you the author, you have to at least find the publisher. And if that publisher is credible, like let's say it's from Pew Research. Pew Research is a credible source, but sometimes their articles might not have an author because it's just general information that they want the public to know. Sometimes sources have both the author and publisher, so check the credibility of both of those things, okay? And then the accuracy, you want to check if the statements or facts are backed up by other sources. So are the statements in the text, the argumentative text that you're reading, are they backed up by good sources? So again, you look at the source's authority, and based on the authority and currency and relevance, you might say like, okay, yes, the facts, they got the facts from a place that was relevant and had good credentials. But you also want to see if they have any grammar errors. If something has grammar errors, that might be a red flag and might tell you that that person is probably passionate about what they're talking about, but they're not really an expert. A lot of times, if you use a blog post as a source, many times they might have grammar errors unless they're really good at writing in English. or whatever language that they're writing in. And also you want to check if the information from the source that you're checking matches the information from other sources talking about the same thing. And if every other source doesn't match the same facts as the ones that you're pulling from the source that you're checking, then that might not be credible. But if the facts do match other sources on the same topic, then yes, it's going to be a good one to talk about or to use, or you can verify that the author is using a good source if you're trying to determine if the author is using a good source. And then the last one, purpose. When you look at a source, you want to know if they're unbiased or impartial. And impartial. Bias means that they're trying to get you to do or think something. So a lot of times in the argumentative text, like if they're trying to persuade you of something, then yes, it's going to have an obvious bias in the claim already right off the bat. But the sources that they use in the argumentative text hopefully are unbiased and impartial, because you can take information from other sources and do what you think is best with them, and that's how people come to their own conclusions. A lot of people might use the same exact information and think the opposite side of what you're claiming. So hopefully the sources that the author uses in argumentative text don't try to convince you to do something, or hopefully it doesn't already agree with the author that's using that source, because that's like preaching to the choir. You want to be as credible as you can when you write something, or the author wants to be as credible as they can when they write something. So pause and take these notes down. Okay, so this is the extended version of the CRAP test. When I was in middle school, I didn't use this scorecard particularly because my teacher made their own, but this one is from Pikes Peak Community College. Yeah, and what you can do here, you can sometimes here it's asking if the currency matters for the thing that you're talking about. Sometimes information, if you want the most recent information for some topics, but if you're talking about something historical and comparing something from back then you might want a source that is dated much older than or much later than more recent. So depending on what you're talking about, you might want it to be more recent, but sometimes you might not care. It all depends. And then after you check, that's just an example of what you check on to right. But once you check all of these on the right, yes or no for each of the questions, then you can start scoring a source from 1 to 10. And then if you think the currency is fine, you put a 10. The relevance is fine, you put a 10. If the authority is somewhat credible but not too much, you can put like a 6, 7, 8. Or if they're really bad and not credible, then you put like a 0 or 1, 2, or 3. Accuracy, again, you score it with what you think. And then you can look down at the bottom, and anything from 45 to 50 is a source that, yes, is credible. Anything below 30, you might not want to use, or the author shouldn't have used it in their text. But yeah, so that's that. Yeah, this is just what we went over. This is just a simplified version. You can just keep the acronym in mind. You don't always have to go through the CRAP test with this scorecard, but we do want to keep these in mind when we're looking at sources. Okay, so we're going to look at the sample text that from the last video, but it's not completely the same. I tweaked it a bit. So again, the claim for this whole text was, there are enormous risks for teens and screen time should be limited. And then the counter argument was there are some benefits to social media and screen time. So the author was claiming that you should limit screen time, but other people, the opposite way of thinking is that there are some benefits to screen time. And then, so for some of the reasons, we can see that they list the reasons before the sentence for the claim. So the reasons that support the claim. For many teens, increased screen time might mean greater anxiety, less sleep, less time for school homework, and might have negative effects on their health. So I just underlined the reasons. We don't have any evidence that support those reasons yet because this is the introductory paragraph. So we're going to go over those in the next couple paragraphs. Yeah, we're going to see how the pieces of evidence connect to some of these reasons. Okay, so here's the second paragraph. Here's a claim again. Screen time should be limited for teens. Here's one of the first forms of evidence. Oh, wait, so hold on. So one reason that screen time should be limited is that it can negatively affect a person's mental health or emotional health, and emotional health. So here we already have a reason right off the bat that supports the claim of the author. So we can go ahead and underline that one in green. But then the piece of evidence that matches this one would be the following. The next sentence says, according to Pew Research, more and more teens use devices. So they found that in 2016, almost 90% of teens have smartphones. Reports found that all of the screen time is making teens less happy. So because most teens have phones, they might be on their phone a lot more. And the author is claiming that because if you're on your phone too much, or if you're on a screen or computer too much, then you're going to be unhappy. So this piece of evidence matches the claim and the reason, one of the reasons to the claim. So that's okay. It's an all right. It's an all right one. But if you wanted to, you could look up what Pew Research was. Doesn't really tell us when that information was published. Doesn't tell us the author who published that information. So that might not score too well on the 2 A's in the CRAP test. But Pew Research, if you check their credentials, they're actually a good source. We just don't know where on the Pew Research website the author got this information from. Okay, so here's another piece of evidence. One report stated adolescents' psychological well-being decreased the more hours a week they spent on screens. And they also found that teens reported having less self-esteem. So again, this claim supports, or this piece of evidence supports the claim. Again, we don't really know when that information was published, but we can assume that because in that sentence it doesn't say where they got that information from, we can just assume that they got it from Pew Research. As the best we can do with this. But the author could have made it more clear as to where they got that information from. And here's another one. Okay, so here's a completely different piece of evidence. We know this because it says another study, so a different study, by the American Academy of Pediatrics found a link between screen time and depression. So, and anxiety, and possibly which can possibly develop depression. and interferes with a person's ability to function. So again, this piece of information connects to the reason that was stated at the beginning of the paragraph. Another study, again, this one doesn't tell us where that study is from, but it's clearly a different study from American Academy of Pediatrics or peer research, but it doesn't really say where. It found that too much social media might create a body image issues with young people because they're comparing themselves. So although this is weak evidence because it doesn't say where they got this information from, it does support the main claim. And then they just restated the claim at the bottom. Okay, so here's the next one. So the main claim was again restated at the beginning of this next paragraph. Screen time should be limited. But in that same first sentence, the counter argument is stated. Some might argue that screen time has some benefits. And here we see a different color of highlighter. The blue highlight means it's evidence for the counter argument. We saw on the last slide, the green is the color for the evidence of the claim. So here, this piece of evidence supports the counter argument, and good arguments should address the counter argument, and this is exactly what the author is doing. But here, the author is saying that some studies show that social media can be supportive for kids and teens to interact with each other and build a community. It doesn't say where that study is from, so it's kind of weak evidence, but it does support the counter argument. But as far as putting it through the CRAP test, we don't know the currency of those studies because we don't know where it's from or who wrote it. We don't know, what's the other part? Yeah, we can't even check the accuracy of those facts because, again, we can't check where the original source, and we can't check the purpose of that study because, again, we can't find it. The author for this whole argumentative text doesn't give us enough information to go back and find it to put this through the CRAP test. So this piece of evidence would score really low on the CRAP test. Right. And then here's another piece of evidence that they found. A site called Karen the Momager blog suggests that certain kids of video games can actually help people with conditions like ADHD. So here we can put this piece of evidence through the CRAP test better. We can check the authority of this source just by like reading the title of where the source is from. Karen the Momager blog. Some blogs are credible, but a lot of times if it's just a hobby blog where people are just writing because they want to get their thoughts out there, sometimes it might not be the most credible information. So here it's titled Karen the Momager. So it's some woman named Karen who's probably a mom, and she's just writing a blog about ADHD and video games. So this site is made up, but if this was real, we could go look it up on the internet and go see if when this information was published. We can learn more about the author of that evidence, and we could probably check the grammar for their piece of evidence and the purpose of the blog. But so even though we can put this through the crap test, again, this piece of evidence might score very, very low. It does still connect to the counter argument. And so here's but then the author of the argumentative text that we're reading, though, he then goes to reference the Pew Research again. And so the data from Pew Research suggests the data from Pew Research and suggests, and they didn't write this well. I tweaked this, actually. It was actually me. I didn't. But the author, let's pretend a different person still wrote it. The data from the Pew Research suggests American Academy of Pediatrics suggests that this is just not the case. So although we're not seeing all the information here in this paragraph, they're referencing information that they stated in the previous paragraph. And we can definitely go back and check the credibility of Pew Research and American Academy of Pediatrics. Those are credible sources, but again, we don't know which articles from those websites are. But yeah, so but this does connect to the main claim that the author is trying to make in this article. Okay, so here's I think this is the last paragraph. So the first sentence of the last paragraph is evidence. Well, it's more of a summary of evidence that was given in previous paragraphs for the claim. So countless studies have indicated too much screen time can lead to decreased happiness, low self-esteem, and even depression. So they're just referencing the information that they stated before. Here in the yellow, the main claim of the author, whoever wrote the text that we're reading right now, restated their claim here. Screen time, there's like risks of too much screen time to teens' physical and emotional health are greater than the benefits, and screen time should be limited. So in the same sentence, they kind of reference the counter argument that there are some benefits, but in all, they still believe that their claim is true, that there's more negative effects than there are benefits. And then the green piece of evidence does connect to the yellow claim. And then here's another counter evidence. In a world where all of our lives are quickly becoming digital, using screen time responsibly is becoming more and more important. This isn't exactly evidence. This is just a summary of the evidence that the author chose to summarize for the counter argument. So yeah, lesson recap. Was this a good argument? So after we looked at or glanced at the whole argumentative text that we just looked at and highlighted, was this a good argument about that screen time should be limited? Which of the following did the argument have? So just take a moment to check mark which ones, or write down in your notebook which ones you thought that the argumentative text had. Rewind the video to go back and check if you forget what it was about or wanted to reread it. So yeah. All right, so now that that you've thought about it, they did have a clear claim. And I'm not check marking it, I'm doing X's, but you can do either. Relevant evidence directly supporting claim. I mean, their evidence was relevant to their claim, but it wasn't the best, but we'll get to that in a bit. Random facts and info. there weren't any random facts and info as far as the information that we saw or the evidence that we saw went. It was all relevant. Again, it was probably not the best information, but it was relevant. The counter argument was stated. Yes, it was. There was at least one piece of evidence for every reason to a claim. There was actually a lot of, if you go back to the second paragraph, just as an example, that whole paragraph was on just one reason, and they had a whole bunch of different evidence connecting to the claim or the reason to the claim. So yes. And then some evidence, but not a lot. There, yes and no. I'll leave that up to you. I'll probably not check mark that one because there was a lot of evidence for the claim, but there wasn't too much about the counter argument. So it didn't really give a fair comparison to the counter argument and between the counter argument and the claim, the main claim. So yeah. So if we put it to the crap test, how many points would you give the currency? So let's just look at this real quick. Has the information been updated? We don't know, so we'll just check no. Does the information need to be current for your needs? Yes. Does the information you found match the topic for your assignment? We don't know, so we'll just put no. Have you looked at the other sources before selecting this one? I mean, we'll assume that you checked out Pew Research and the American Association of Pediatrics. So we'll say yes. We checked what we could. Are your questions answered by this source? I mean, some of them. We can leave that blank. Authority, who is the author or publisher of the information? We do know. So we can write down Pew or American Association of Pediatrics. Can you find and verify the author publisher's credentials? No, because we don't know exactly which studies the author was talking about. Does the URL help you determine? We don't have a URL, so no. Can you verify the information in another source? I mean, you could look up different sources about talking about the same information. So yes, if you wanted to continue more research, you could. Did the author back up his or her statements with evidence and list sources? I mean, they did have a lot of different evidence, but they didn't really list all their sources. So we'll just say yes, but not too much. Are there lots of spelling or grammar errors or typos? There were a couple. I mean, in my opinion, if you have one, it's too much because you're publishing the. If the author published this for other people to read, then yes, that one is too many. What is the purpose or information? Does it teach, entertain, sell? It's trying to sell you an idea. Well, it's trying to persuade you or get you to agree or see why they thought that screen time should be limited. Is the information unbiased? Does the author or publisher seem impartial? No, because they're claiming. But just because in an argumentative text they're claiming something doesn't mean that their evidence is not going to be credible. It's just that they use that evidence to get to their conclusion or their claim or make their thesis. Are there political, religious, cultural, or other biases present? I mean, no, it doesn't really say why they think that other than they're using that research. So no. So we can go through this and score each category. I'll give this a 3 for currency. I'll probably give this like a 0 just because or you can't give it a 0. I'll give this a 1. Does it is it relevant for relevance? I mean, it was pretty relevant. The information presented in argumentative text was relevant. Yeah, it was relevant. So I'll give it an 8. The authority, I'll give that one a 1. I'll give that a 3. Just because we had some sources that we could check, but we couldn't really check which article specifically. Accuracy, we don't know, so I'll give that a 2. Well, you can go back and check some information. You can like look up information. So maybe like I'll give that a 3. You can find information why screen time is bad for you. So purpose, I was trying to persuade you, but that's the point of an argumentative text. Well, not no. A persuasive text trying to persuade you, but argumentative texts are kind of similar. So I'll probably give this another 8, just because. Okay, so if it's an informative text and they're clearly trying to persuade you, but it was supposed to be informative, then yes, it wouldn't score that high. But because this is an argumentative text, it's fine. Okay, so the total score, 8 plus 3 plus 3 plus 8, 23. Yeah, 23. So it didn't really score that high. Anything below. So this whole argumentative text that we went through wouldn't be the best text to believe. I mean, you probably could find other sources that that agree with the author which we read from, but here it doesn't really. We probably wouldn't want to trust this one completely. We have to do our own research. Okay, so here's another question that I want you guys to think about. What was wrong about the argumentative essay? We kind of talked about it, but think about it again. So what was wrong about it is that we couldn't really trust the evidence. 1, because we couldn't really check it really well. And 2, some of it was clearly from a source that didn't know too much about what they were talking about. Remember the Karen the Momager blog? Just the name alone gives it away. But yeah. One last thing I want you guys to think about. What's the most important part of an argument? And there's no right or wrong answer. There's multiple answers, but what do you think is the most important part of an argument? Is it the claim? Is it the evidence? The reasons? The mention of the counter argument? So in your own words, write in your writer's notebook what you think is the most important. So yeah, all right. So now that you've done that, I already gave you some that might be more important, but let's say you chose evidence. If you chose evidence to be most important, you probably said something like, I believe evidence is the most important part of an argument, because without evidence, your claim is empty, and that people might not listen to you if you don't have things to back your claim up. And also, it's important to have good evidence. So it's also very important to have good evidence. You can't just have evidence. You have to have good evidence. But if you said the claim, if you said claim was the most important part, you might have said the claim's the most important part because people need to know what you stand for. And if they don't know what you stand for and you're just spitting out random pieces of evidence that you can't connect anything to, then our whole argument's lost too. But yeah, those are just examples of what you could have written down in your notebook. Right, so thank you guys so much for sticking out with this one. I know it might have been a little long, but please look to the learning guide and continue some practice to try evaluate whether a source is or an argument is good or not. See if and check the sources to see if those are good. The whole point of this video was to help you understand what makes a good argument. So you have to evaluate the argument and you have to evaluate the evidence. And if the evidence is good, then most of that part of understanding what makes a good argument is done. But also another thing that makes a good argument is a clear claim and the restatement of, or not restatement, the statement of the counter argument, so the opposite side. So again, good evidence, clear claim, and a stated counter argument, and evidence to that counter argument, so you know what the other side is. So yeah, that's how you evaluate a text to see if it's a good argument or not, or has a good argument or not. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one.